first one, what would you name as the sort of first element of your style that's really distinctive and interesting?
The pentatonic scale, probably. I don't know. I mean, it's, I guess, my style, if there is one. It's just evolved naturally over however many years I've been playing guitar now, at least 3. One of which, I guess, people kind of seem to hone in on is this, I don't know, I've had kind of various names for it, I guess, over the years. The kind of slidey bendy thing, the multi-step bend, whatever it is. All of it boils down to me, in essence, trying to sound like a singer. A lot of my musical influences, spoken about this at length on various things in the past. I'm kind of keen not to tread on all ground, but a lot of my influences are singers more than they are guitar players, whether it's soul singers, whether it's Aretha Franklin, whether it's Otis Redding, Sam Cooke. It's more modern guys, it's Paolo Nutini, just insert great vocalists, vocalists or singer-songwriters who have the capacity to tell a story and be characterful with their voice. So a lot of what I do is just trying to emulate that in some way. So a lot of the kind of weird little inflections or idiosyncrasies, that kind of little kind of slides, bends, that one was bent then, so you're kind of hinting at the note above it and then back to. But you can slide that just as easily. It's a different effect. The slide is much more deliberate. It's a bit more kind of dramatic, I guess. The bend is much more subtle. But it's all done to try and emulate that fluctuation you get in a human voice, I guess. And again, all of the kind of, all that kind of stuff. It's just me trying to sound like a singer. How effectively or not, let the people of YouTube decide, but that's in essence what I'm trying to do, is capture a bit of that vocal idiosyncrasies that you get with a great singer. So that would be one, I guess, that kind of very subtle, or if you want to make it more deliberate, in essence you're just going, which if you actually play those notes at that speed, it makes it a very minor kind of sounding thing. That's not the kind of the aim of the game here, is to linger on the notes so long as for the notes to actually become a recognizable tone, so much as just a little, which weirdly sounds very major. You play it like that, it sounds very major. If you drag it out, it suddenly becomes very minor. So you can kind of, I guess the lesson there is that you can kind of get away with murder, really. You can lean into and reference notes which ordinarily wouldn't particularly work in the musical context of what you're playing, but it just gives it that human element, I guess, that kind of vocal kind of fluidity.
I mean, one of the things a lot of guitarists get stuck in is a cul-de-sac of just working across the neck. There they are in their pedal.
Yeah.
And you have to have, to be fair, it's a bit like playing or learning slide. You have to have some accuracy moving up and down the neck. So how did you develop that?
I think, again, that was, there's not many conscious things that I've done on the guitar in my life in terms of actually, it was because I discovered it relatively young. I was, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 when I picked up a guitar, and I loved it. I just fell in love with it instantaneously. So all of the stuff that you go through and learn on the guitar was so innate because I just threw myself into it. I just spent every hour of every day playing it, much to the detriment of my GCSE and A-level results as well, it's worth pointing out. So there's not many things that I've done which I can actively remember. This is how I learnt this. This is how I went about, kind of reverse engineering this. But one of the few things that I kind of really do remember is thinking to myself, well, exactly that. You get very stuck in this idea that the guitar runs that way. It runs, as you're looking at it, down from side to side, because that's how your scales move. And it's not. All you're doing, that's just a kind of a slightly less ergonomic way of playing what is on one string, in essence, which is how a vocalist would approach it. Vocalists don't think in terms of, I guess a vocalist chords are linear by nature in that they kind of tend to run low to high. So why would you not try and capture that in some way on a guitar? So a lot of the soloing I do, any kind of lead work, is more often than not on one or two strings, just because to me at least that gives it a fluidity and a freedom which feels more natural. So all of that kind of, you could do it on multiple strings, you could kind of run up and down your scales, but knowing your shapes and your kind of tones and your intervals, if you want to play a major scale, knowing where those notes lie relative to one another on one string may seem incredibly simple, but it gives you the freedom then for... referencing another couple of notes in there, but principally it was just a G major scale. Knowing where they all lie relative to one another on one string is just incredibly helpful. You know, that's a lot of the way in which I approach guitar is that way as opposed to that way. You know, it just makes more sense to me, I guess.
And the sort of vocal element you're trying to draw out in that style, you know, and succeeding so wonderfully with, has that dictated how you set up the guitar and what kind of compression and drive you prefer?
I guess, yeah. Again, that probably is more of a subconscious thought process than an actual conscious thought process. I'm not a huge kind of high gain guy, particularly. The higher the gain sounds that I tend to use tend to be a combination of gain pedals stacked as opposed to, oh, this is my high gain sound. And I think there probably is some subconscious thought process there as to kind of, well, multiple gain pedals stacked together gives you a flexibility in terms of like, well, that's maybe won't work with that sound, or that won't work with trying to kind of convey what I'm trying to say, you know. So yeah, I mean, in regard to the setup of the guitar, I'm pretty chill, to be honest. I like a relatively high action and pretty heavy strings. Not so much for any kind of tonal benefit, so much as when I get, you know, on a stage in front of a couple of hundred people or whatever, the adrenaline kicks in and Thor's hammer of a right hand especially kind of starts wheeling around. And, you know, I just kind of hit the strings too hard. It's a massive flaw in my kind of, you know, technique, I guess, but I'm quite a tactile, kind of hands-on quite player. Obviously I play a lot with my fingers as well on my right hand, and I just enjoy the kind of experience of digging in on the guitar, and consequently heavier strings and a slightly higher kind of gauge of, a slightly higher action rather, kind of all feeds into that, I guess. So yeah, again, not really ever thought about it much, to be honest, so...
Well, let's move on now to the second secret to your style.
Again, the multi-step bend thing, you know, that kind of idea of multiple notes or multiple tones within one bend. So let's pick something like... It's probably a sound that a lot of people would identify with Dave Gilmour, I guess. David Gilmour, it's a very Pink Floyd-y kind of thing. But again, for me, the kind of genesis of that was that vocal thing, you know, trying to kind of capture degrees of that. So it's essentially bending up to a note, and then picking another note above that to find and bend up to. A big part of this, undoubtedly, is knowing your guitar and knowing its tension, I guess, knowing its kind of scale length, knowing how heavy your strings are, how far and how hard you have to kind of bend to be able to hit a note. Like I said, if I was sat down on 9s now, for example, as opposed to 11s or whatever, you know, it's going to be a case of like, oh, I'm massively overbending to try and get that note, or I'm, you know, kind of flat, I'm sharp, etc., etc. So a huge part of this is undeniably being confident with your guitar and knowing where things are relative to one another. Yeah, let's take a bend like... You can bend up that semitone to get that note. If you want to be a bit more adventurous, you can kind of go up another couple of frets. Or... And again, that's just a confidence thing of knowing how far the frets are apart, which note you're aiming for. The people that I've seen, I get tagged in a load of kind of covers of stuff that I've done on Instagram, and it's always very sweet and it's incredibly flattering. But one of the key kind of things that I've noticed, I guess, when people try and kind of nail that is it doesn't, whether it's a lack of practical application or whether it's a lack of thought having gone into it, I guess, knowing what notes you're aiming for is so essential. It's integral to that, because otherwise you end up with, you know, cat kind of crying, and it's a little bit kind of atonal and strange. So knowing that if you're kind of going and you're in essence trying to hit this note next, knowing that you have to go to this note and go that far up as opposed to and ending up with, which is a very different kind of tonality, you know. So all that kind of stuff. Again, it's just knowing what notes it is that you're trying to kind of convey and actually being at one with your guitar, you know. That sounds a little bit Jedi, doesn't it? But yeah, being confident with your guitar and knowing kind of how far things are apart relative to one another.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the sort of pedal steel approach, you know.
Yeah.
You can reach notes by lots of different routes, so you have to kind of be familiar enough to bring it all together seamlessly.
Know how to find them. Again, it kind of feeds into that vocal kind of idea of listening to great vocalists and not necessarily just listening to the notes that they sing and how they sing those notes, where their vibrato feathers in. Guitarists, we're all absolutely guilty of it, this idea of just landing on a note. And it's so rare to hear a guitarist just land on a note and just, without wanting to go, you know, wobbling away for the sake of it. And it's like, that's not a particularly singy thing to do. Probably one of the greatest examples of a beautiful vibrato for me is someone like Whitney Houston. And you listen to her vocal style, and the vibrato feathers in towards the end of a note. She'll land on a note, and it will increase in depth and intensity as that note decays, as opposed to being a one-style-fits-all. I land on this note, and I do this. Whether or not I apply that in the way in which I kind of want to when I'm playing is another, you know, matter entirely. But that's what's in the back of my mind, is be sympathetic to what you're playing and what you're trying to say, and just having that human element in it, I guess, you know. So yeah,
it's quite interesting you were saying about, you know, you have to have a really strong sense of what the tension of the strings is going to be like, because I think you're quite brave about it. You swap between guitar models. I've seen you play Mustangs, I've seen you play, you know, obviously this beautiful Yamaha that is your main instrument, all of which will have different scale lengths. Do you, when you play the short scale stuff, do you go up even heavier than?
Yeah, so the I think you mentioned Mustangs there. I've got a 56 Duosonic, which totally took me off guard. I knew they were small, but it wasn't actually until it arrived. I was like, oh, this feels like a toy. This feels very small, and I think that's maybe 12s on there, maybe, which sounds insane, but obviously relative to the scale length of the guitar, that kind of feels probably comparable to about 10s. Yeah, I mean, stuff like that. The only thing I've ever noticed with that guitar is that the whole kind of, I'll slide up to go to the 10th fret and I'll be on the 15th fret or something. Everything just feels like it's kind of condensed. But yeah, stuff like that I guess takes a little bit of getting used to. But again, I think it's probably just the mark of a hopefully half decent musician, that you kind of adapt to stuff like that, and you kind of, that's just working conditions, you know. You learn to adapt with the tools that you're kind of given. And as much as obviously you look at stuff like this, you look at the board, look at the guitar, look at the amp, it's all quite specific stuff that I've kind of accumulated and kind of clearly used a lot, you know, in this case. You know, my background, I guess, was playing South Wales pubs and clubs when I was 15 with a Marshall and a Les Paul and nothing else really. So I've kind of run the full gamut of stuff over the years, from Strats to Les Pauls, you know, loads of pedals, zero pedals. So it's just part of being a musician, I guess, is knowing how to make kind of any setup work, you know, and adapting to scale lengths, for example, or different gauge strings, you know. But that is one of my kryptonites, is light gauge strings. I would take ludicrously heavy strings over light gauge strings any day of the week, because, like I said, the moment you put me in front of a room full of people, the adrenaline starts coursing through your veins, and suddenly everything kind of gets hit a little bit hard, and you end up with that horrible wobbling of the strings kind of finding their way into tune after you've hit a big E chord. So yeah, that's my kryptonite, is 8s or 9s.
So you're not on the Billy Gibbons school of thought with
no, but again, it's a flaw in my playing, you know. It's a kind of it's something I should probably work on. I don't need to hit the strings as hard as I do when I play, but it's just, you know, knowing that and actually putting that into practice are two very different things. And it's just an excitement thing, you know. You get on stage and you kind of want to get into it, and a part of that for me is just digging in a little bit more. And it feels like a more tactile experience. It feels like a more enjoyable experience for me if I can kind of hit it that little bit harder, you know. I like to feel like I'm having to work to get something out of it, as opposed to, you know, I've kind of spoken about this in videos in the past and stuff, but I have certain guitars which are just, This is so counterintuitive, it's insane to say, but they're so easy to play that they don't particularly inspire me to play. You kind of want to feel like you're fighting it a little bit to get something out of it. And, that the heavier gauge strings on this, the slightly higher setup, all feeds into that ethos, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're in good company, because I remember years ago I interviewed Robin Ford and he said the same
right,
thing about his telly.
Cool.
That's how he liked it.
I feel slightly less mental now then. You put it on YouTube, people will think I'm absolutely insane, but it's just the way my brain is wired, I guess.
So we've come to the third and final secret to my style. So what are you going to choose?
My right hand is something I get a lot of questions about. And again, it's one of those things that's a little bit kind of hard to reverse engineer. I mean, the way I'm holding a plectrum there, I guess it's fairly indicative of what I'm talking about, in that a lot of the stuff that I do uses a plectrum. A lot of the stuff that I do just uses my kind of fingers, and there's multiple reasons, and I've spoken about it at length, so again, I'm kind of always hesitant to kind of go into this ad nauseum, but it's a tonal and it's a textural and it's a dynamic thing for me. I mean, the reason it started, bluntly, was not through any great foresight of mine when I was 15, thinking I should learn to play with my fingers and I'll be more like Jeff Beck or Mark Knopfler. I think it was literally just being sat on a sofa, dropping the pick, not being bothered to get down and find it wherever it disappeared in the ether, and thinking, right, let's try and replicate what I do with the plectrum with my fingers. And inevitably you can't, at least initially. Especially being the big Slash fan that I was when I was a kid, a lot of it was kind of, kind of faster stuff or harmonic minor runs and all this kind of stuff, and it is hard to replicate with your fingers, but the trade, I guess, is that it gives you a lot more kind of delicacy, or it gives you a lot more nuance and just variation in what you want to say. And ultimately, a pick is great if you're trying to play accurately or you're trying to play quickly. Pick always comes out. The downside of a plectrum is that it kind of always sounds like a plectrum. It always sounds like a relatively heavy piece of plastic. In my case, these are Dunlop 1.14. They kind of have a sound. They have an attack. They have an immediacy, which even if you play really hard, or if you play softly, there's still like an attack and like an energy to the front end of the note. If you play with your fingers, there's that soft roundness, I guess. Even if you dig in with your nail, which is probably as close as to natural comparison or equivalent to a piece of plectrum, you can kind of get a bit of a kind of faux plectrum. But to my ears, at least, it still decays in a different way. It still hasn't got that energy and immediacy of a plectrum. So it's just a variation thing, And then on a practical level, for me, it's always been a case of tucking that plectrum behind, or I guess in that crease of my index finger. For some reason, when I was a kid, I went through a phase of playing pretty much exclusively with that nail when I was doing a lot of punk rock stuff, and the consequence of that is that nail just refuses to grow, snaps like a wet Kit Kat at the first sign of trouble. So I'm kind of like, well, if that's no use, that can be its purpose, that can be its use, holding the pick, and you get that kind of little weird action there to kind of like fold in and fold out. It's about as close as I can ever get to sleight of hand, I guess, for a remarkably clumsy person. But yeah, it just gives you a... a lot of that softer stuff then, I just don't think I could physically do that with a pick. You still have an attack to it, which doesn't necessarily as conducive to conveying what you're trying to say, So it's just it's something which has crept into my playing over time, and I always kind of struggle to explain why I do it, when I do it, because it's so innate at this point. I guess if I was to try and backtrack or reverse engineer that, it's when I'm trying to say something more delicate or more soft. It's your fingers. When you want an accuracy or speed or an intensity, pick comes out, But having that facility, I guess, to be able to kind of like flick back and forth like that is quite helpful, and it's just crept into my playing over time. But then, again, on a practical level, thumb pretty much exclusively for the lower strings, so you get that kind of claw. Meanwhile, my second finger, my ring finger, do the higher strings, so it's kind of like D to G to B to E kind of thing, you know. Little finger doesn't get a hell of a lot of use on both hands. I'm very guilty of that, and U2 is more than willing to let me know. But you get that. I mean, a key there. I'll find which key that is in a minute. But yeah, it's just a texture and a tonal dynamic kind of variation, which is quite nice to kind of be able to flit between, I guess. So yeah, I wish I could think of a better answer.
No, that's a great answer. But one thing I will add, which I think I find interesting, is I don't know where you sit on this fence, is
well, I'm truly in the middle of it, I imagine.
I've known a number of players who use their right hand, the fingers of their right hand on electric, who play the guitar right-handed, but are left-handed. They write with their left hand.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Good point. I mean, there's a bit of left-handedness in my family. My grandfather was left-handed. My dad was left-handed, and all but had it knocked out of him when he was a kid. I think my grandfather had a lifetime of impracticality that, you know, being left-handed kind of does bring in some senses. So I think was quite keen to encourage my dad not to go down that route. Consequently, my dad's party trick was that he could write his signature backwards with his left hand perfectly. It made him a lot of money, as you can imagine, that trick. So, there is a bit of left-handed. I play pool left-handed, or snooker. So there's a bit of the kind of devil's work in me somewhere. But, I don't know. It's kind of... Weirdly, when I was a kid, when my parents first gave me a guitar, I was very young, and I was given like a tiny little toy acoustic. The first thing that I kind of did naturally was have it that way. And my dad was like, no, other way. Trust me, it'll make life easier if you decide to go down this route. But yeah, it's strange. I've heard a lot of arguments as to kind of like, well, left-handed pianos don't exist. You know, why do left-handed guitars exist? And I guess there is a relatively strong case to be made for. It's kind of your wrong hand or your weaker hand does a lot of work there when you're thinking about it. Probably, arguably, the more intricate work in actual fingering of stuff. Like, obviously, your right hand or your more dominant hand is very important, as we just discussed at length, you know, with all the kind of textural stuff going on. But you probably could make a relatively strong case for kind of, well, just adapt to kind of, you know, you might even be at an advantage if your dominant hand is doing the arguably more difficult stuff. So,
well, Chris, thanks so much. I really enjoyed, delving into your wonderful style of playing. And, thanks so much again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.